Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how did the governments of Western Europe change in the late 20th century and some of the issues that were going on in Europe economically as well as politically as we get nearer to present times. So the first two questions we're going to talk about: how was Western Europe impacted by economic crises of the 1970s? And obviously you can see here I spelled crises wrong, so we'll try to fix that. I can't fix it. All right, so we're keeping it like that. So in the early 1970s, we see a general economic decline. The U.S. was also facing a recession during the 1970s, and there's a couple of reasons why. One was there was a collapse of the international monetary system. Since 1945, it had been based on the U.S. dollar, which was valued in gold at about $35 an ounce. But the post-war, we spent so much money, the U.S., on billions on foreign aid and foreign wars, that this was weakening our currency. In 1971, President Nixon decided to stop the exchange of U.S. currency for gold. The value of the dollar fell, and this led to inflation increasing worldwide. In addition, there was a post-war boom, kind of encouraged by cheap oil from the Middle East. This permitted a lot of what we call big science and energy-intensive industries to develop, like cars, chemicals, electric power, and they expanded very rapidly. And there's going to be kind of a little bit of a pushback from that. A couple other things that kind of led to this economic slowdown. In 1967, we have the Six-Day War in the Middle East, where Arab leaders got very, very angry because it was a surprise attack launched by Israel against Egypt. It exacerbated anti-Western feelings in Arab states. As a result, in 1971, OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, felt that the price of crude oil was declining compared with the rising cost of manufactured goods, and they wanted to present a united front against Western oil companies, and they're going to put an oil embargo, especially after, in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, which was Israel backed by the U.S. quickly won. It actually started out as a surprise attack by Egypt, but Israel, being backed by the U.S., managed to quickly win. OPEC responds with an oil embargo on shipments to the U.S. Within 1 year, crude oil prices went up in the U.S. 4 times. And so what we see is high unemployment, living standards and productivity declined, and inflation soared. There was gas lines, there wasn't enough energy, and that really kind of hurt the economy. In 1976, we start to see a modest economic recovery. But then there's the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Their oil production collapsed as a result, and the price of crude oil doubled in Iran. This led to, again, unemployment and inflation rising, and an uneven recovery began to occur in 1982. And we have a development of what's referred to as stagflation, stagflation. It's a combination of stagnation and inflation. So it's low growth and high inflation. So prices are rising, the economy is growing very slowly. This is going to lead to a recession. Many feared in Europe that this would derail the movements towards European unity. The common market or the European Economic Community was still only gaining new members, and they feared that this would kind of throw off the whole process. But in 1973, Denmark, Iceland, and Great Britain are going to join. In 1981, Greece will join. 1986, Spain and Portugal. And they began cooperating in international undertakings. The developing world was also really hit hard by this slowed economic growth. There basically was a global economic downturn, and this essentially widened the gap between the rich and the poor, between rich and poor countries. So the developing world was borrowing money from the U.S. and Europe, and this set the stage for an international debt crisis. In East Asia, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan were all exporting high-tech consumer goods to the West, and this was shifting manufacturing jobs away from the highly industrialized countries of Northern Europe. So the world's economy finally began recovering in the 1980s, but the issue was they were no longer able to create jobs to replace those that were lost. So those manufacturing jobs that left Northern Europe, just like those manufacturing jobs that left the U.S., were gone forever. by the end of the 1970s, the foundations of economic growth were shifting away from manufacturing and industry to high-tech information industries, things like computing, biotechnology, services like medicine, banking, and finance. And so this brings in what's referred to as the information age, or the post-industrial society. So we see the streamlining of the production of goods. A lot of industrial jobs became unnecessary. So heavy industry lost a lot of ground. And what you have is the development of rust belts, which were areas that were formerly industrialized, and they're now ghost lands. So this happened a lot in Europe, in places like the Ruhr district of northwestern Germany, where you see a lot of vacant lots and rusting machinery and empty inner cities. We see this in the United States in Detroit. And so the misery index, which is the measure of inflation and unemployment, sounds like a very cheery thing, increased in North America and Europe, and it was greater in Western Europe. In 1985, unemployment was the highest level since the Great Depression. So there was 19 million people without work. People were losing jobs, people were going bankrupt, there was homelessness, there was mental breakdowns. A lot of this actually manifests itself in the punk rock movement of the late 1970s, where the young could kind of express their hostility and cynicism. The welfare system, which we talked about in class from the post-war era, prevented a lot of mass suffering and degradation, and did allow for some preservation of political stability. But as a result, government spending was increasing during the 70s and 80s to kind of support this welfare state. So in 1982 in Western Europe, 50% of the national income was spent on social programs, and that was up from 37% 15 years before. And the people were okay with the spending, but they resisted the higher taxes. So it's kind of like what the Greeks are going through right now. And this imbalance led to a great deal of budget deficits, led to a great deal of debt, and led to a great deal of inflation, which is why we see the conservative parties are going to come into power during this time period. So conservative political leaders were willing to make necessary reforms, even if it led to social dislocation, even if it led to inequality. So the 30 years following World War II, the Social Democrats and the more conservative Christian Democrats agreed that economic growth and social stability would only be achieved through full employment, high wages, some government regulation, and generous welfare provisions. Because once that welfare state was set up, it's very hard to dismantle. By the late 1970s, because of all the economic issues, these ideas were beginning to change. So Great Britain, US, West Germany, all of these governments moved to the right. France and Spain moved to the left, but all realized that they needed to cut government spending and regulation. So the new conservatives of the 1980s are going to follow the philosophy of neoliberalism. This has very distant roots in laissez-faire. And when I talk about neoliberalism, I'm not talking about liberalism in the 20th century sense. I'm talking about liberalism in the 19th century sense. So it had roots in laissez-faire policies, which means a hands-off policy of the government towards the economy. And this was favored by the 19th century liberals like Adam Smith, who actually we're going to be reading in the next couple of weeks in AP World. The government cut support of social services such as housing, education, health insurance. It limited business subsidies and made in general just less government regulation. And it called for the privatization of a lot of the industries that had been nationalized when the welfare state was set up. So for instance, transportation, communication areas. And they decided they wanted to tighten government spending. And this led to more efficiency, and this allowed them to increase their private profits. So in places like Great Britain, we're going to see a shift towards conservatism because the people were getting really fed up with the high taxes and the large state budgets. And all of this is going to lead to the election of Margaret Thatcher. So let's talk a little bit about Margaret Thatcher. So that takes us to what should be our third question. And I'm sorry that it says number 2. Should be a third question. How did Britain change under Margaret Thatcher? So like I said, this kind of, stagflation and high employment of the 1970s led to these conservatives coming to power. So the 1980s are referred to as the Thatcher years. It was a kind of controversial time. They wanted to take on more free market policies, and they wanted to transform post-war Britain. Now, before Margaret Thatcher comes to power, basically from 1964 to 1979, the Conservative and the Labour parties in Britain were kind of flip-flopping in power. There was a couple of reasons why they were why the Conservatives or the Labour Party, neither of them could keep power for long periods of time. Number one, they could not solve the problems in Ireland, and there was many terrorist attacks led by the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army, in response to the suspension of the Northern Ireland Parliament. So on the island of Ireland, there's essentially two countries. You have the 9 counties that make up what's called Ulster, which is Northern Ireland. That's part of Great Britain. The rest of the island is part of the Irish Republic. There was, the Northern Irish did have their own parliament, and they were part of Great Britain, but because of all the chaos that was happening with the IRA launching attacks, wanting to pull Northern Ireland into the Irish Republic and away from Great Britain, in 1972, the Northern Irish Parliament is suspended, and Northern Ireland is brought under direct rule, which was not taken too well by a lot of groups within Northern Ireland. The other reason why the two parties kept flip-flopping in power, so they couldn't solve the issues of Ireland, and they couldn't deal with the bad economy. So because they weren't able to fix the economy, the people were really dissatisfied, and that's why we see the powers flipping. So Thatcher comes to power in 1979, and she comes to power on a program of that she's going to lower taxes, she's going to reduce the bureaucracy of the country, she's going to limit social welfare, restrict union power, and end inflation. And she's commonly known as the Iron Lady. Thatcherism became known as the austerity measures of welfare to reduce inflation, and she basically broke the power of the labor unions. So, like I said, she wanted to cut spending on healthcare, education, public housing, reduce taxes, and privatize many government-run enterprises. She encouraged low and moderate income renters in state-owned housing projects to buy their own apartments at low prices. In doing that, she actually created a new class of property owners. In her first 3 years, the heavy industries such as steel, coal mining, and textiles were shut down, and unemployment doubled to over 12% while she was in office. There was a huge gap between the rich and the poor, which then widened, and this increased poverty led to more crime. So she's kind of very, in some ways, a controversial leader, because the working class struck against her. There was lots of strikes and protests, and some of these became violent riots against her rule and some of the things that she was governing and some of the things she was trying to do. There was a lot of street violence, and a lot of it had racial overtones because many of the immigrants from the former colonies were coming into Britain to live, and they were taking very poor jobs and were facing all sorts of racial prejudice, and they were clashing with the police. So that was another issue that she had. So her methods did cause a lot of problems. So the south of England or Britain prospered, but the old industrial areas of the Midlands and the North declined. Think about, like, when we're talking about an AP world, like with Manchester, cities like them, they began to decline. There was high unemployment, there was poverty, there was violence, and the cuts in education began to undermine quality. So we could see there's all sorts of, like, pretty bad, serious riots in the streets over Margaret Thatcher's rule during reign. And here, actually, this is Northern Ireland. So this is in the city of Belfast. There's murals all over the city of Belfast, either supporting those who are sympathetic to the IRA or supporting those who are sympathetic to the Union, meaning staying part of Great Britain. So she broke one of the major clashes she had with the coal miners, and she eventually managed to break the power of the coal miners union, which upset many workers. There was lots of tax riots while she was in office as well, because she wanted to try to reform the tax system. which she had limited success with. As far as foreign policy, she took a very hardline approach. She was very similar to Reagan. Her and Reagan are contemporaries. She did a large military buildup and replaced older technology. And then in 1982, Argentina tried to take control of the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands were off the coast of Argentina and had been controlled by the British. And so Argentina was defeated by what was known as a very short-lived, known as the Falkland Islands War. The British came in, sent in troops, defeated the Argentinians, and this led to an increase in nationalism in Britain, and increased patriotic support for Thatcher. Despite that, though, in the 1990s, as we get into the 1990s, the Labour Party began to gain more support. They wanted to replace, basically, one of the reasons why Labour began to gain more support in Britain is because Thatcher and the Conservatives wanted to replace local property tax with a flat tax paid by every adult. Thatcher argued that this would make local government more responsible to the electors. People argued it would let the rich pay the same tax rate as the poor. This led to huge anti-tax riots that broke out, and her popularity fell. By the end of November of 1990, her own party was in revolt against her, and it caused her to resign, and she was replaced with John Major, who then is eventually replaced by Tony Blair, who then is replaced by, oh Lord, I can't remember who comes before Cameron, but there's someone in between Tony Blair and Cameron. It's going to annoy me that I can't remember his name right now. But so here you can see some of the images of some of these tax riots that broke out, and some of the violence in the streets over these tax riots, and some of the ways people viewed Margaret Thatcher. So this really should be the fourth question. So the question is, how did France try to improve their economy? So let's look a little bit at what's going on in France. So in 1981, the Socialists were the dominant party in the National Assembly in France. Socialist Francois Mitterrand is elected president in 1981, and he moves France to the left. He basically, prior to him coming to office, the center-right parties had dominated for 25 years. So when Mitterrand comes to power, he decides to deal aggressively with the economic problems. In 1982, he freezes wages and prices. His goal is to reduce the budget deficit and to reduce inflation. This did begin to help the workers. We start to see in France higher minimum wages, more social benefits. They gave a 5th week of paid vacation to salaried workers. People in France worked a 39-hour work week, and the rich paid higher taxes. The banks and certain industries like steel, space, electronics, and insurance were nationalized, and the local governments were given greater powers. However, this did not work very well, and they had to return to austerity measures. Because within 3 years, we start to see a decline in support for the socialists. Basically everything winds up becoming reprivatized. And like I said, austerity measures have to be met because they couldn't pay for all these various different things that they were proposing. Because in 1993, the unemployment in France had risen to 10.6%, and that led to the conservative mayor, Jacques Chirac, to be elected in May of 1995. He's going to be in power for quite some time through 9/11. He then is succeeded by Sarkozy, and then Sarkozy was succeeded by France's current president, Hollande. I can't say his name. It's Hollaride, I think I never know exactly how to pronounce it, but the current French president. So now let's look, which should be question 5, let's look at Italy. Why was Italy experiencing political instability? So in the 1970s and 80s, in Italy, we have more of a coalition types of governments. By 1991, they're in their 50th post-war government. In 1991, this man here Andreotti, Andreotti, is elected prime minister in 1991. By that point, he'd already served as prime minister 6 times. Most of these coalitions were led by the Christian Democrats. So we see kind of a great deal of instability kind of building in Italy for quite some time. Corruption was very common. In 1993, hundreds of politicians and business leaders were actually under investigation for taking bribes. Also, in the 1970s, economic recession, like we said, in the rest of Europe was very severe. So Italy depended on imported oil for energy, so they were very vulnerable to the increase in oil prices. With all these economic problems that Italy is going to have, this is going to lead to a great deal of social unrest. There's going to be student unrest, mass strikes, terrorist attacks, and so in 1978, the former prime minister, Aldo Moro, is kidnapped and he's killed by a terrorist group known as the Red Brigades. The mafia was spreading across northern Italy. This was all happening in the 70s. In the 80s, the communists gained 26% of the vote. They began to take charge of some of the municipal governments. But what we see is basically a very kind of corrupt and unstable government in Italy for the most part. You can see some of the effect that's like this, the body of Moro being taken away. Also in other places like in Spain and in Ireland, we have these separatist movements beginning to grow. So in the Basque regions of northern Spain, we have what's called ETA, ETA. What they were fighting for was for the Basque region to be separate from Spain. They used bombings and assassinations to force the government to grant them greater territorial independence. In 1975, Francisco Franco, who was the fascist leader of Spain, dies. He had ruled Spain for 40 years prior to that. The new constitution is going to give the Basque region special autonomy, but this still did not make the Basques happy. And so we start to see more terrorist campaigns by ETA. And in the 80s, about 400 people were killed in these terrorist attacks. And when the Madrid train bombing happened in the early 2000s, the initial response to it was not that it was Al-Qaeda. It was originally thought that it was ETA, because there was this constant problem of terrorism in Spain. And then going back to Ireland, there's even a division within the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which was fighting for power, more autonomy, and for Ireland, Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic. So the provisional IRA kind of broke off of the IRA. Ireland gains autonomy in 1922, and the Irish Republic is developed, but Great Britain still holds on to control, like I said before, of the 6 Protestant counties in the north. So in the 1960s, the IRA was attacking British security forces that they felt were occupying Northern Ireland. In January of 1972, we have an event that's known as Bloody Sunday, in which the British soldiers shot and killed 13 demonstrators who were protesting anti-Catholic discrimination in the town of Derry. The violence escalated from there, and for 30 years, the IRA would attack soldiers and civilians, and over 2,000 soldiers and civilians and IRA members were killed in what was referred to as the Troubles. And we'll talk more about that in class later. So I want you to think about, why were the governments unable to kind of stay in power in the late 20th century? Why do we have all of this kind of instability kind of in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s?